At 24,000 feet, the sky is supposed to be empty. Thin air. Frozen silence. Nothing but engine noise and cloud glare. But on that morning over occupied Europe, the sky tore itself open. Steel screamed. Fire flashed. And a B-17 Flying Fortress, 4 engines, 10 men, built to survive hell, was cut clean in half. Most men would have died instantly. One didn't. The German fighters came out of the sun. They always did. Black crosses, tight formation, cannons already firing before the bomber crews could even shout a warning. The B-17 shook as shells punched into its fuselage, tearing metal like paper. Plexiglass shattered. Oxygen lines snapped. The cold rushed in hard enough to burn. Then the hit came. Not an engine, not the cockpit. The spine. A 20mm shell ripped through the midsection right behind the bomb bay. Another followed. Then another. The aircraft folded. Not exploded. Folded. The tail section, guns, stabilizers, 2 crewmen, sheared away and vanished downward, tumbling end over end into cloud. The front half stayed in the air for half a second longer, just long enough for someone inside to still be alive. He was the waist gunner. No rank that mattered. No medal yet. Just a kid with frostbitten fingers wrapped around twin .50 caliber machine guns. When the plane broke, his world turned vertical. Sky below. Earth above. The safety harness snapped tight, biting into his chest as gravity tried to tear him out into nothing. He looked down and realized something impossible. He wasn't falling alone. The guns were still bolted to him, and the enemy fighters were still there. The Germans pulled up, circling, confused. Bombers didn't do this. Men didn't survive this. But then the gunner squeezed the trigger. Tracer fire ripped upward from a falling wreck. Bright red lines clawed at the sky, cutting through cloud in shock and disbelief. A Messerschmitt took rounds through its wing root and spiraled away trailing smoke. Another pilot broke formation, too close, too curious, and vanished in flame. The falling gunner was screaming now, not in fear, in rage. Because the air was so thin, his lungs burned with every breath, and because the bomber behind him, what was left of it, was still being shredded. Because his crew was still up there. The Germans didn't expect resistance from below. They never trained for it. One pilot radioed something frantic before being cut off. Another pulled too hard and stalled. Chaos replaced discipline, all because a man who should already be dead refused to let go. Wind tore at his flight suit. Ice formed on his goggles. The horizon spun like a broken compass. Every second, gravity dragged him faster, but his finger never left the trigger. Far above, the remains of the B-17 began to lose altitude too. Engines flaming. Control gone. Men inside praying or bleeding or both. They would never know what bought them those extra seconds. Only that suddenly, the sky felt less hostile. Down below, civilians would later report hearing gunfire where no planes were flying. German flak crews swore they saw a man falling out of the clouds, firing as he fell. Command would dismiss it as panic. But pilots would remember. Because some legends don't come from victory. They come from refusal. Refusal to surrender. Refusal to stop. Refusal to die quietly. And at 24,000 feet, with nothing left to lose, one gunner decided the fall wasn't the end. It was just the last fight. The fall accelerated. Wind howled so loud it drowned out everything. Engines, gunfire, even thought. The gunner's body was yanked into a brutal, tumbling descent, the ruined midsection of the B-17 spinning like a torn flag above him. His harness held, barely. Metal screamed as bolts ripped loose one by one, but the gun mount stayed welded to the broken frame, dragging him through the sky like an anchor made of steel. Below him, cloud. Above him, enemy fighters, suddenly unsure whether they were hunters or witnesses. One German pilot broke radio silence.
Schießt. Fällt und schießt. He's firing. He's falling and firing.
No training manual prepared them for that. The Messerschmitt scattered, not from fear of death, but from something worse, disbelief. Their attack pattern collapsed as pilots overcorrected, trying to keep altitude while tracking a target that was dropping faster than physics said it should be fought. The gunner didn't aim carefully. He didn't have to. At terminal speed, even small corrections turned into wide arcs. His tracers carved the air like whips, ripping through space where fighters had to be. One crossed that space. It didn't cross again. Inside the remaining half of the B-17, men clung to whatever still existed. The pilot fought dead controls. The co-pilot worked an extinguisher that sprayed nothing. The navigator bled quietly, map table gone, floor gone, sky rushing in where aluminum used to be. Then something strange happened. The fighters backed off, not retreated, hesitated. The pressure lifted. They didn't know why, but somewhere below them a falling man had turned gravity into a weapon. At 18,000 feet, the air thickened just enough for pain to return. The gunner's arms shook violently now. Recoil slammed through him, numbing fingers that were already white with cold. Blood leaked from his ears. His vision tunneled. Still, he fired, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant realizing he was falling out of the world. A German fighter made one last pass. Too close. The gunner saw the pilot's goggles for a heartbeat. Wide, reflective, human. Then, the left engine caught fire. The Messerschmitt rolled, vanished into cloud, and never came out. Silence followed. No engines nearby. No gunfire. Just wind. Just falling. The gunner finally noticed the altimeter needle spinning uselessly. His parachute pack tugged at his back, heavy, real. An option he hadn't allowed himself to consider. Not yet, because above him, far above now, the broken bomber still fought gravity. He could still hear it in his bones. At 12,000 feet, his strength failed. His fingers slipped from the trigger. The guns went quiet. For the first time since the sky broke, there was nothing to do but fall. Clouds swallowed him whole. White. Cold. Endless. And inside it, he counted, not seconds, heartbeats, because that was all that mattered now. When he broke through the bottom of the cloud layer, the world rushed back. Fields, rivers, roads too small to save him if he waited too long. He reached for the ripcord, paused, looked up once more. The sky was empty. Then he pulled. High above, what remained of the B-17 slammed into the earth miles away. Some crew lived, some didn't. They would later say the fighters vanished suddenly, as if spooked. None of them would know why. The gunner hit the ground hard enough to black out, but he didn't die. German troops found him minutes later, unconscious, frozen, still strapped to part of a machine gun mount torn clean from a bomber at 24,000 feet. They stared. No one spoke, because they were looking at a man who had fallen through a battle and taken it with him. When he came back to consciousness, the first thing he felt was weight. Not pain. Weight, as if the sky had followed him to the ground and decided to sit on his chest. German boots surrounded him. Snow crunched. Rifles clicked off safe. Someone spoke softly, almost respectfully. Another laughed once and stopped when no one joined him, because the gunner was still strapped into twisted aircraft metal, and because his fingers were still curled like they expected recoil. They cut him free carefully, not gently, but carefully. Men who had seen the Eastern Front didn't rush this. They treated him like an unexploded shell. They searched him. No maps, no orders, no pills, just a photo folded until it was soft as cloth. A woman, a dog, a porch somewhere warm. An officer arrived and stared at the wreckage with narrowed eyes. "From which aircraft?" he asked in clipped English. The gunner didn't answer. He couldn't. His lungs burned like they were filled with needles. His throat was raw from screaming into wind no human was meant to survive. They dragged him to a truck. As it drove, he saw the sky again through the slats. Clear now. Empty. Like nothing had happened. Interrogation came fast. Too fast. They hadn't expected him to live. They sat him under a bare bulb and asked the wrong questions. What bomber? What unit? How many aircraft? He said nothing, because he didn't know. He hadn't counted. He had only fired. The officer finally leaned forward. "You were shooting while falling," he said. Not a question. A statement that sounded like disbelief. The gunner met his eyes. "Yeah," he croaked. Silence filled the room. Then, the officer leaned back. "Impossible," he said quietly. They sent for pilots. 2 Luftwaffe flyers entered the room, faces tight, eyes avoiding the gunner at first. One of them finally spoke. "It was him," he said. The other nodded once. That was all. After that, the tone changed. No beatings, no shouting, just long stares. They fed him, gave him water, wrapped him in a blanket that smelled like oil and old smoke. Because soldiers respect defiance, even in enemies. Weeks later, Allied intelligence intercepted German pilot chatter that made no tactical sense. References to the falling guns, warnings about fire from below, orders to keep distance when bombers broke formation. The Luftwaffe never admitted fear, but it adjusted. Meanwhile, the gunner was moved east, then west, then north, camp to camp, never long, always watched, as if someone was afraid of leaving him still. Other prisoners heard whispers before they heard his story. A man who fell out of a bomber firing. A man who brought the sky down with him. Some laughed. Some didn't. Those who didn't stayed quiet around him. Winter passed. Spring crept in. The war turned. When the camps were liberated, they found him thin, but alive. Still breathing thin air like it might vanish again. An American medic read his tag twice, then a third time, then said softly, "You're not supposed to be here." He went home after the war. No parade. No headline. The report couldn't be written without sounding like fiction. Command filed it under combat anomaly. Pilots remembered it anyway. Years later, bomber crews would joke nervously before missions. If we go down, someone would say, "Keep firing." Someone else would answer, "Yeah." Like that one guy. No one ever said his name. Because legends aren't always meant to be repeated, only remembered. The paperwork tried to erase him, not deliberately, just efficiently. After liberation, officers compared reports and frowned. A B-17 destroyed at altitude. Tail section lost. Enemy fighters disengaged unexpectedly. No official line for man fired while falling, so they wrote around it. He was flown home under medical orders. Doctors said his lungs would never fully recover. His hearing would always ring. Cold would ache in places that once held steel. They asked him what happened. He told them the simple part. "I kept shooting." They didn't ask for more. The Air Corps interviewed him once. A captain slid a folder across the table. Inside were Luftwaffe pilot statements translated into English. Words like panic. Impossible. Fire from below. The captain looked up. "Did you know you hit anything?" The gunner shook his head. "I wasn't aiming to count." They offered him a citation. Silver Star. Maybe more. He declined. Said it belonged to the crew who didn't come back. No one argued. Across the Atlantic, something quiet happened. German fighter doctrine changed. Orders were issued to disengage from damaged bombers faster. Never fly beneath a breaking aircraft. Avoid vertical pursuit during structural failure. The reason was never written down, just a note in the margin of a training manual. Unexpected fire possible. Bomber crews noticed. Veterans felt it first. A slight hesitation. An extra second before a final attack run. The sky gave them room it hadn't before. Years passed. The war became memory. Memory became story. Story became rumor. At reunions, someone would always bring it up late. After drinks, "Did you ever hear about the guy who..." And someone else would interrupt. "Yeah, I heard." And no one would finish the sentence. Because everyone knew how it sounded. And because everyone also knew pilots who swore it was real. He lived quietly, worked with his hands, hated airplanes. Loved open fields. When asked about the war, he talked about the cold. Never the fall. Never the guns. Once, a young pilot asked him what it felt like. He thought for a long time, then said, "Like the ground was coming to stop me, and I wasn't done talking yet." The pilot didn't ask another question. The story should have ended there. That's how wars like to close their books. Quiet survivor. Unspoken hero. Life stitched back together. But some battles don't stop when you hit the ground. Years after the war, intelligence officers noticed something strange in old Luftwaffe loss records. 3 fighters lost on the same day. Same sector. Same altitude. All listed as quote, 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 quote. None credited to bomber fire. None explained. One margin note appeared again and again, written by different clerks in different handwriting. Engaged damaged aircraft, outcome unclear. Veteran German pilots, interviewed decades later, avoided the subject. One finally admitted it off record. "That day," he said, "we stopped trusting gravity." In air combat, gravity was law, predictable, reliable. Until that morning. Training films changed after 1943. Not dramatically, just subtle warnings added to diagrams. Avoid vertical proximity. Maintain distance during aircraft disintegration. The reason was never shown. The reason had no footage. Because no camera had ever followed a man down like that. The gunner never returned to the air. Not as crew, not as instructor. He refused flight benefits, refused invitations, refused memory. But memory didn't refuse him. He dreamed of falling for years. Not screaming. Falling silently, guns still warm, sky rushing up like an unfinished sentence. He would wake with his hands clenched, fingers curled tight around nothing. Once, during a storm, thunder cracked overhead, and he dropped to one knee instinctively. Neighbors stared. He laughed it off, but he never went outside during storms again. What no one ever told him was this. Somewhere in a Luftwaffe archive, a pilot had written a final entry before being declared missing. Translated years later, it read, "Bomber broke apart. Thought engagement finished. Fire came from below. I do not understand this sky anymore." That pilot never returned, neither did the certainty that death always followed rules. The war ended, but in the air, something had shifted. Not tactics, belief. Because once you see a man falling through the world still fighting, you never look at the sky the same way again. The official record ends cleanly. Mission lost. Crew scattered. Enemy fighters disengaged. Nothing about a man falling through 24,000 feet of sky with his gun still firing. Because war records prefer numbers. Not defiance, Years later, when historians tried to reconstruct that mission, they ran into gaps that made no sense. German fighters broke off early. No flak support followed. Bombers escaped a zone that should have been fatal. Something had interrupted the pattern, something that didn't belong in any manual. The gunner aged quietly. His hair went gray early. His hands shook when cold weather came. He never looked up when planes passed overhead. But every year, on the same date, he did one strange thing. He stood outside, no matter the weather, and watched the sky in silence for exactly 1 minute. Someone once asked him why. He answered without emotion. That's how long I was falling before I stopped shooting. In 1945, the world learned that wars end when flags change and documents are signed. But the men who fight them know better. Some battles don't end. They just lose altitude. The Germans lost aircraft that day. The Allies gained time. And somewhere between the clouds and the ground, a rule of war was broken forever. That once you're falling, the fight is over. Because that morning proved something terrifyingly simple. Even when the sky tears you apart, even when gravity takes control, a soldier can still choose how the fall ends. This was Dark War Records, where history doesn't end with victory. It ends where records fall silent. Some stories aren't written because they sound impossible. Others are buried because they prove something worse, that humans don't stop fighting when they're supposed to. They stop when they decide to. Subscribe to Dark War Records, because some legends didn't survive the war. They survived the fall.